down to sea level again, and they're one earthquake away from being without water for months. So we're working on trying to get those desalination plants going and helping all those communities. Those are the fun things that I get to deal with. Some people dream about this stuff. We get to live it, and I think that this group here is one of the perfect places to talk about those issues. And I think that when we get into the next group, the panel, we're going to start talking about some of the issues of groundwater, transboundary conflicts, and so on. So I think, I talked about those issues, but the good news is the cooperation, and I'll close with that. The cooperation that is being done. My colleague, Temis Alvarez over there was just in Laredo, and they're talking about cooperating between the two Laredos, trying to get the issues of sewer lines and aging infrastructure. We have been, as I said, working with the city of Tijuana, Agua Prieta, Douglas, New Mexico, Acuña del Rio, in cooperation teams that are binational. And I think that's the good news. And I think this setting for a binational conference is also even greater news. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hinojosa, for sharing with you comprehensive view of the border and some of the things that NADBank is doing. I can tell you that NADBank has also helped a lot of communities along the U.S.-Mexico border in operator training. There's been a lot of workshops, a lot of training in San Antonio, plus other places along the border where they have funded operator training and also supervisory and management training in order to make sure that the facilities are well operated and maintained. At this time, I'd like to move forward now with our keynote address. When we first started planning this conference and we knew we wanted to have a keynote individual, we thought about it quite a while in terms of who might be invited, whether it would be somebody from a political background or education background or technical background, what have you. And as I thought about it, I thought of Dr. Teresa Maldonado. Dr. Maldonado, I met her in the first week that she was here last summer in July, I think, as a new Dean of Engineering at the University of Texas at El Paso. For some of you, it's UTEP. We call it UTEP. The centers that Lisa mentioned, I work with the Center for Environmental Resource Management, which is CERM, which is headed by Dr. Bill Hargrove. You'll hear from him this morning. Dr. Tom Davis heads the Center for Inland Desalination Systems, SIDS, established some 7 or 8 years ago. And then I work with those two centers, and I work with the College of Engineering. And the professors there, some of you know most of them, Dr. Shane Walker, Dr. Tony Tarquin, Dr. Ivan Santiago, primarily. Those three are the most prominent individuals in water. And so together, those centers have done a lot of work. I can tell you when I went to UTEP, I thought, why not have UTEP be a place where people come to study water, water scarcity in particular, right? And when you see some of the presentations that are going to be done here, when you see the work that's been done along the U.S.-Mexico border, and when you look at what Mr. Hinojosa talked about in terms of the future, you can work with Mexico and with the countries to the south of Mexico, universities and consultants and others, to basically try to improve the whole Americas. So why not have UTEP be that type of university? So when I approached Dr. Maldonado, I knew that her background was not in water, but as I talked to her, she shared a passion for water. She's an electrical engineer. You can see by her background, she's uniquely qualified. She's worked at Texas A&M within the UT system, and she's worked at the National Science Foundation, where she handled hundreds of millions of dollars in grants, that are made by the National Research Foundation, National Science Foundation. And so she is uniquely qualified. She has both bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Georgia Tech University, the Rambling Wreck from Georgia Tech. I remember seeing them play in the Sun Bowl a few years ago. They did a great job. Very professional, too. I think they played USC. USC came out like a bunch of thugs, to be frank with you. I mean, the whole organization seemed, but when you looked at Georgia Tech, from the cheerleaders to the team to everybody, it was a different presentation, you know? I'm sorry if I offended somebody from USC, but I was really impressed with Georgia Tech. So I'm very pleased that Dr. Maldonado is here to share with us a few words about what she sees in water and the role that UTEP might play in that. So please welcome Dr. Teresa Maldonado.
Thank you very much, Ed. I thought the previous speakers were going to give my presentation before I got up here. So good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here, and as Ed mentioned, I'm an electrical engineer, but I've worked with researchers all across the Texas A&M University system. And as you know, Texas A&M has very strong engineering, water program in civil engineering primarily. We have the I shouldn't say we anymore, I'm not there. They have the ag program, which also has water, College of Geosciences, which also has water. And so back in the day when I was there, trying to get in the academic setting, the different disciplines to have a conversation about water was very difficult. Also, as Ed mentioned, I'm an electrical engineer, but I'm also a big picture thinker. I like to step back and look at issues and provide context. And my parents were born and raised in border towns. Dad from Eagle Pass, mom from San Benito down in the valley. And so my dad enlisted in the Air Force right out of high school, so I moved around a bit. But we always came back to these border towns to visit family. And over the decades, I was just alarmed at how the Rio Grande River itself was changing all up and down the border. And I'm new to El Paso, so I'm seeing it here. And so it's not just a local issue, you know, it's all threaded throughout the border, as you know. So I start asking questions, what's happening upstream, etc. So I have a deep passion about understanding such things. It's a big system when you think about it. Also, when we have meetings like this, and I listen to brilliant presentations, and then I leave going, boy, I'm really pumped up, but what's next? And so I'm hoping to outline a couple of things that maybe by the time you leave this meeting tomorrow, you're going to be asking what's next and what is your personal role, because we can't keep leaving this to somebody else. So a colleague of mine at UTEP, Dr. Steve Ryder, learned that I was going to be participating in this meeting, in this summit. And so he emailed me right away and said, well, back in 1991, we had a summit. And he tried to get, and I think he was the director of CERM at the time, and so he got parties together and went on a retreat in Colorado to have a conversation about water in the future on the border. When you think about 1991, it's pre-NAFTA, but there was discussion that NAFTA was going to happen. It was pre-9/11. Desert Storm was happening in the Middle East. President George H.W. Bush was in the White House, and Governor Ann Gates just became the governor of Texas. So context. So Dr. Ryder shared with me the notebook from the meeting. He still had it on his shelf. He had to find it. And then when I saw the date, I started smiling and snickering. And so I started peppering him with questions. I looked at who attended this meeting. He had all the names in there and their contact information. And Ed was there, by the way. And so I started asking him, what were the outcomes of that meeting? And how have those outcomes played out today in 2018? And he goes, well, those are great questions. And I asked more, of course. Now in 2018, we're looking at NAFTA being renegotiated, and we have a heightened sense of national security because of 9/11. But Steve Ryder told me that the biggest challenge from this meeting was just getting people to talk. So we're going to be talking about challenges over the next 2 days, but I also want to think about water as an opportunity. And so glass half empty, no pun intended, glass half full. And so how do we kind of have a universal way of thinking about a natural resource? So today I'd like to, as an electrical engineer, look at water, provide a little context, offer a framework. I'm not saying this is, but this framework I'm going to offer is a way I think about things. Talk about data and how important it is today to inform our decisions and how we plan, the role of UTEP, and some comments about the future. So, in looking at context, as we all know, we have about 15 sister cities. But when we start talking about issues such as water, we tend to keep the conversation local. So when we look at this, we have 246 counties, 273 municipalities in the region. Our border is often viewed as an illustration of challenges of binational environmental management in the context of a harsh physical environment, rapid growth in population, and economic integration. Of course, there are many political and economic challenges. According to the latest Good Neighbor Environmental Board report published in 2017, since the 1940s, the population of the 10 U.S. and Mexican border states has grown more rapidly than the national averages of either country. So that's a huge stress on the border region. By 2000, some 12.4 million people lived in the border counties, and by 2010, it approached 14.4. Now we're looking at a projection of 19.5 million by 2020. That's just 2 years away. I really don't know what the exact number is right now, but this report was issued last year. So when we look at the long-term trend, we do have explosive growth in the population. The maquilas have exploded all along the border, and we have a very dynamic system. So we need to define the problem. But I also like to look at context further. Europe must be having these challenges, right? And so in 2010, I noticed that they published the Water Framework Directive. And I'm going to quote a couple of things from this report. Member states had to hold extensive consultations with the public and interested parties, to identify, first of all, what are the problems, and then what are the solutions to be included in the river basin management plans. This sentence really popped out for me. Public support and involvement is a precondition for the protection of waters and for the identification of both the problems and the most appropriate measures to solve them, including their costs. So I don't know, I'm new to El Paso, I don't know if there were ever any public forums to discuss water in the future, but that may be something we think about. We have the intellectual capital in this room right now, but we don't have all parties at the table. One interesting example was a case study on the Danube River. The Danube River Basin District is the largest in the EU and illustrates the variety of waters within one river basin that includes mountain streams all the way to coastal waters. International cooperation around the crucial waterway has a long tradition going back to the 1880s. In 1994, 14 countries, not just 2, but 14, and the EU got together to sign the International Convention on the Protection of the Danube River. So it can be done. But we can talk about water, but when we talk about water and its future in the region, we also have to understand that it's interconnected with energy, and Alex mentioned wind energy in Mexico, for example. But there are sources of energy that are really water intensive. We have to look at our food supply, and our health. So I also like to think about what could be some tipping points where we go from talking about issues and problems, and we have for many years, to reacting to something devastating. Look at 9/11. That really challenged a lot of our infrastructure in the way that we do emergency response and communication networks. So when do we really get serious? Well, this photograph is from this month's issue of National Geographic. This lake, Pupo, is 1,232 square miles. And at the longest length, it's 52.2 miles. So when you think of 52.2 miles of lake, where all the residents around this lake were depending on fish and other wildlife for their living, is now completely depleted. And so now we see population migrations. And so things can happen, and this I would call a tipping point. This I got off of the website of the Environmental Defense Fund. This one's a difficult read, but it shows in a big snapshot what all the tipping points in climate change are at this time. So what about a framework to look at what we're talking about today? Now, I did this on purpose because this is a very complicated image. But what we have here is a complex system, so I'm going to think like an engineer now. So we have the water life cycle system, that's a natural system, but we also have man-made environmental issues, the population growth, policy, industry growth. We have new technologies that are implemented. What are the implications of those? And we have many, many elements to this question. And so then I ask, okay, if you look at this line that's coming right on the right side of the screen all the way to the lower right-hand corner, that's an axis of time. So all of these components in the system change with time, but they don't necessarily change at the same rate. So you have these interdependencies. And so what I'm coming to is, number one, we have a complex problem here. Number two, do we have the right people at the table? We have water scientists, water engineers, policymakers, financial backers, et cetera, but we may need computer scientists, we may need more mathematicians, software engineers, we need people that have a background in network theory and many other types of disciplines that may not be in this room right now. So what about the data? What data is going to inform this complex system we need to take a look at? So first of all, the problem is, are we defining it correctly, the problem correctly? And that would be your complex system. Secondly, what data do we need to address this system and the complexity of it so that we can get informed information and make smart decisions moving forward? Now the role of UTEP. I think it's been widely reported that we're now over 25,000 students and we're located here on the border. In the College of Engineering, we are over 4,500 students now. And just from last year to this year, we grew 12% in the college without any increase in the number of faculty. But as you can see, our graduate program is also growing. So the question is, and my responsibility is, am I providing the environment in the college for our faculty to explore questions that we need to explore and prepare our students to participate in finding solutions to our challenge here? I also like to show this one because we're in Texas, we tend to look east to the rest of Texas. But I like to look at assets in the region. We have many potential partners, and maybe we have representatives from every one of these partners from the United States. But we also have many more partners in Mexico. And an interesting thing that I learned is that we're closer to San Diego than to Houston. So we could probably head out to California Wouldn't it be really special to define our system all the way to California, pivot, look down to Brownsville, and see what kind of mega model we can develop and inform Washington, D.C. That's our responsibility. We should be informing Washington and not the other way around. And so I like this kind of challenge to look at the big picture and really clearly define a model moving forward. UTEP, of course, does research. That's what universities do. But today, the role of universities is to drive economic development. So we have to take these innovations that we have in the laboratories and eventually commercialize them. Here, from this perspective, we can work with the Borderplex Alliance. We can work with our partners in Mexico and think about strategies for economic development with limited water resources and energy, et cetera. I also would like to highlight this particular center that we have at UTEP. This is funded by the National Science Foundation, the Nanosystems Engineering Research Center for nanotechnology-enabled water treatment. So the notion of going from basic research all the way to commercialization must be addressed in this type of center. It's led by Rice University, and UTEP is a key partner in it. And we're looking at how we use nanotechnology and nanoscience to develop catalysts and membranes for water treatment. Also, industry can become members of the center and actually drive what some of their research directions may be. This would be a great venue for those of you in the audience to have a conversation with our researchers and our students to define what our future should be. In fact, Rice would like to see that. Rice is the lead. They're in Houston. They know we have a special ecosystem here, and boy, we could do some home runs if we can get some of you here in the room to partner with this center for a huge impact. And NSF, the National Science Foundation, by the way, loves international partnerships. So what about the future? Well, in doing some web searches in advance of this meeting, I noticed that the Santa Fe Institute has a water workshop this June, and they're going to be addressing exactly some of these questions. So this is basically a think tank workshop that's taking place, and notice that they're looking at socio-hydrological dynamics. So they're looking at the big model where you have human systems interactions. And this is not simple. This is a complex system. So those attending this workshop are going to be thinking about the future, near term and long term. And I think that's very exciting. I can't wait to see the outcome of that. So in conclusion, I tried to provide context from a non-water engineer perspective. Think about a big picture instead of your own area of activity in the water discussion. Think about how we can use data wisely to inform our future. Think about UTEP and how we can partner with you. And always think about the future. So what's next is we need to be asking questions and challenging ourselves if we are asking the right questions. Let's narrow it down to like 3 or 4 key questions we need to be addressing so that we can go into action and actually develop and define a future for El Paso and Juarez. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maldonado, first of all, for taking time from your busy schedule to be here and for your thought-provoking remarks. There's no question that innovation and economic development, all of that goes hand in hand. In the time I've been in El Paso, you've seen how El Paso has really flourished and is growing. A lot of that has to do with some of the programs that have been put in place, but I appreciate your remarks to the kind of challenges. I was not aware of this institute going on in Santa Fe, but something to look into and something for all of us to think about in the next couple of days. So thank you very much. At this time, we're going to move on to our first panel. Mr. Alex Hinojosa is going to chair that. So if the members of that panel would come forward, We'd appreciate it. Dr. Maldonado, do you have time to join this panel? Would you come up, please? Thank you.
So the caliber of this group is impressive, and I'd like to what we're going to do is each one is going to give a brief presentation, and then we'll have some Q&A. David, I guess you start David Gutzler, there you are, ready, is a PhD from MIT. His interests are in climatology and meteorology, and has a great number of publications on the variability of weather and the climate. And he is now with the University of New Mexico.
Apologies, folks, in multiple ways. So my good friend and colleague Greg Garfin, as Alex said, can't be here. He kindly provided 30 slides that I was supposed to go through in 10 minutes. And so maybe it's a blessing in disguise if they didn't get loaded properly, and with apologies to Greg. Between us, Dr. Garfin and I are here to kick off a discussion of challenges and opportunities by focusing on the challenges. So Greg's talk is about climate change on the Rio Grande, and then my talk, which was to follow, is about natural variability and the part of natural variability of the hydrologic system here, which provides a challenge for us, and that's drought. In the absence of slides, let me briefly try to summarize what the major points of Greg's talk are, and we'll see a little bit of review of that in the slides that I have to follow. When we talk about climate change, we have a lot of evidence about how the climate is changing now and how it's likely to change in the future. And the real challenge for southwestern North America is that the particular components of climate change that we have the most evidence for, both in terms of observed climate change over the 20th century and projected climate change, are moving us in the direction of more severe aridity. So we know that the temperature has been rising rapidly across the globe in general, but across the subtropical latitudes and across southwest North America in particular. Greg had a slide showing climate change that's been observed since the middle of the 20th century in excess of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And my own work in New Mexico suggests that that's a conservative estimate. The number that I present in talks is more like 3 degrees Fahrenheit, which is close to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius just in the last generation. It turns out that that rate of change of temperature, which we've observed over the past 40 years, is really quite close to a mid-range estimate of what projected climate change is expected to happen over the remainder of the 21st century. In other words, the climate is now increasing at about a rate of 4 degrees Celsius, 7 degrees Fahrenheit per century. That's what we've observed over the past half century, and that's what's projected to continue, estimated by models driven by plausible increases in greenhouse gases over the course of this century. There is a fair amount of uncertainty in quantitative uncertainty, I should say, in those estimates. But there is no plausible climate change projection for this part of the world that does not include substantial warming trends for the rest of this century, with the quantitative rate of change to be determined in part by policy decisions that we may or may not make in the near term. So that's the big climate change signal. However, that temperature change has important hydrologic considerations. In particular, on the Rio Grande, the upper Rio Grande is essentially a snow